Hi everyone, my name is Nikhil Patnaik. I am a PhD student from the University of Bristol. The area of my research focuses on the development of novel programming abstractions to improve the usability of security APIs. However, first I need to understand what the problem is. And as a first step towards finding out, I ran the study titled Usability Smells, an analysis of developers' struggle with crypto libraries, along with Joseph Hallett and Awais Rashid. So I'm going to quickly go through some definitions, as these terms are very frequently used in my study. So firstly, what is a cryptographic library? A cryptographic library is quite simply a toolkit of operations that a developer can use to implement cryptographic algorithms and features to better secure their application. Now, what is a smell? A smell is a structure in the code that indicates a violation of a design principle, and overall it negatively impacts the quality of the design. So we're going to talk about the differences between code smells and usability smells now. So code smells are indicators that a piece of software code may be of a lower quality than desired. So a code smell signifies that while a piece of code may not be broken, it is in violation of a design principle and therefore may be fragile and prone to failure. Following the idea of a code smell, we have a usability smell. So the idea here is that a usability smell is an indicator that an interface may be difficult to use for its intended users. So developers struggle with programming interfaces in the same way that users may struggle with user interfaces. Okay, so an example of a code smell is Fowler's shotgun surgery. So the idea here is basically, say if a developer wants to make a change. They've made their intended change to a certain class, right? But they may also need to make other smaller changes to the surrounding classes as well. Now the issue arises when they need to keep track of all these changes. And in doing so, they may miss out an important change. So what the code smell signifies is that if the code smells of shotgun surgery, the code may pass all the tests you run it through. However, the smell suggests that there's a deeper issue within the code structure, which you need to have a look at. Okay, so let's talk about what the problem is. So cryptographic APIs are hard to use. Many studies have highlighted recommendations, guidelines, and principles to suggest how to improve the usability of crypto APIs. But we need to ask the question if these usability recommendations, we need to ask whether if the usability recommendations are not being implemented. So how can we tell when such usability recommendations are not being implemented? Okay, so the idea here is basically to make developers understand the importance of usability smells and understand the mistakes they make while designing the library, what principles they may have overlooked, and what principles they need to address in order to successfully address the usability smells that come along with it. So developers may know the principles, however, they may not be aware of the usability smells that come along with it. So in this paper, we focus on 10 usability principles defined by Green and Smith. And in this paper, we focus on two key questions. The first being, what are the issues developers face when they're using crypto libraries? And what are the telltale signs that one of the 10 usability principles is being violated? Okay, so Green and Smith wrote this great paper. So basically, they got a list of usability guidelines based off API for API usability, and reworked it to address crypto APIs. But are the Green and Smith principles right? Okay, so here are the 10 Green and Smith principles. One important point to note here is that the principles themselves are written in a positive manner. Now, what I mean by this is, if we take abstract, for example, this is considered their golden rule. So the idea here is that you integrate the cryptographic functionality with like a standard API so that the developer doesn't need to interact with the cryptographic API in the first place. Now, you can tell by the framing of that statement that it's written in a positive manner, right? So how can we spot when Green and Smith principles are not being followed? And what are the issues developers face? And are the issues developers face fixable with the principles they suggest? And how can we tell when developers are struggling with the cryptographic library? Okay, so we started off with 2,491 questions, and we ran a thematic analysis on them to find the recurring issues developers face. And from this, we arrived at 16 usability issues. So these issues basically captured the core issue developers face when they're asking these questions. We categorized these 16 usability issues into 7 themes. So in the paper, I go into more detail as in the examples and how these issues manifest in questions. Now, the relationship between the usability issues and the 10 Green and Smith principles allow us to identify the 4 usability smells. So the smells themselves are indicative of the principles that are not being observed, basically. Okay, so in order to identify the developer struggle, we analyzed 2,491 Stack Overflow questions, and we examined them from a range of 7 different crypto libraries. Now, these crypto libraries themselves cover a vast number of languages and use cases. So OpenSSL, Libsodium, and NACL, they come from C. Bouncy Castle comes from Java. SJCL, Crypto.js come from JavaScript. And PyCrypto comes from Python. Within that, you can see from the chart that most of the questions, they come under OpenSSL. But there are other differences. So for example, OpenSSL is considered a low-level crypto API. What this means is it's very detailed, and usually the developers who use it have a high level of expertise when it comes to cryptography. On the other hand, you have Libsodium, which claims to be usable. Now, when you look at the way Libsodium is structured, it's a highly abstracted crypto API. So we go into more detail here. Okay, so let's look at a few of the questions and see how the issues manifest within the questions themselves. Okay. Okay, so the developer states that they wish to use a certain function, which is supported by the library. However, the developer says that they cannot find the relevant information associated with the function, and therefore, they don't know what to do next. So that's pretty much the question. So this type of issue moves on to missing documentation. So this is how it's classified, right? In this example, the developer has used the library, but they failed, right? This is quite common. They would post their code on Stack Overflow and quite simply ask, what's gone wrong here? So as a result, the answers usually give the same code back, but with the amendment made in the correction. So this would come under what's gone wrong here. Okay, so these types of questions, they raise the question of appropriateness, right? So the developer usually has like a task or a project in mind, right? And they want to know which library, if there's more than one library, would be most appropriate to use for the project they have in mind. Or say if they've already selected a library, within that library, say if there's more than one function that achieves the same output, which function is most appropriate for the project they have in mind? So this type of question comes under, should I use this? Okay, these types of questions here, there were many instances where the developer struggled with using functions from a library, quite simply due to the fact that they have a lack of knowledge of fundamental cryptography. So here, the developer sets out to create their own certificate. However, they don't understand the difference between a trusted certificate that's created by a certificate authority that's been verified versus an untrusted certificate which they've created themselves. So this comes under lack of knowledge. Okay, so all right, these types of questions are also common. The example I think I can explain here is, say if a developer has used OpenSSL for years, right? They've done countless projects on it and they understand how OpenSSL works. their mental model has now been structured to how OpenSSL has basically been structured, right? But let's say if they're going to start this new project where they're going to have to use M2 crypto, which is a Python library, right? So basically, they have this mental model of how OpenSSL works, right? And they're trying to recreate the same functionality in a different library, M2 crypto, right? Which may have a different different structure, different model, right? So the questions they raise is basically asking how they can use the mental model they have of OpenSSL, the one they've borrowed, and use it to use a new library. So these types of issues come under borrowed mental models, right? Okay, these types of questions, so there are many, okay, so the developer is basically struggling to integrate the library with other platforms and possibly other libraries themselves, right? So in this example, they're trying to encrypt using OpenSSL, but decrypt using another tool. So these types of questions come under compatibility issue. Okay, there were many questions so like that look like this. Developers struggle on the very first step of using a crypto library, and that step is quite simply building the crypto library and running the tests. Now, these types of issues come under build issue. Just to give an example, 18% of the OpenSSL, of the questions that came under OpenSSL were attributed to build issues. Okay, so here's like an overall mapping of basically how, what the usability issues developers face. I covered like one from each category. Okay, so everything highlighted in red are the 16 usability issues. The ones highlighted in blue are the themes the usability issues have been categorized into. So just to give an overview, usage issues, so this is quite simply the developer asking questions about usage. So they may ask questions about appropriateness or quite simply how to use this. System issues, this comes from build issues and performance issues. Not knowing what to do, and this comes from maybe the developer having a lack of knowledge, which may lead on to passing the buck. Not knowing if it can do, so this raises the question of the ability of the crypto library. So you may have like an unsupported feature, or the developer may have to use a borrowed mental model. Missing information comes from missing documentation, maybe a lack of example codes, or quite simply a clarity of documentation. Programming is hard, comes from abstraction issues, what's gone wrong here, and API misuse. Issues across time and space covers compatibility issues and deprecated features. Okay, so this table here shows the relationship between the usability issues and the 10 Green-Smith principles. Now, if you remember, earlier we made the point that the 10 Green-Smith principles are written in a positive manner, right? So in contrast, the usability issues are written in a negative manner. So the way you can understand this is, say if a developer fails to fully implement a usability principle, we might expect to see questions that show the developer struggling with one of the usability issues we identified. So yeah, based off that relationship, we came up with 4 usability smells. Now, 3 of which, the first 3, are covered quite nicely by the Green and Smith principles. However, the final one, not so well. We're going to go through the usability smells and basically look into them in more detail. Okay. Need a super sleuth. So basically, the user needs to be a super sleuth in order to find the relevant resources they need to correctly use a function from the library. Confusion reigns. This usually takes place before the task, so the developer may be struggling as to how to use the library, or again, raise questions of appropriateness. Now, needs postmortem. This usually takes place after the task has been completed. So the developer has used the crypto library, but something has gone wrong. Now, the developer needs to figure out whether there's some type of issue they caused, or whether the issue is associated with the library itself. Okay. doesn't play well with others. So this is the issue. This is the usability smell that's not very well covered by the Green and Smith principles. Now the issues at play here are build issue, compatibility issue, and performance issues. Now we did find a bit of a relationship between the build issues and the 10 principles. However, performance issues are not covered by the 10 usability principles by Green and Smith. Okay, so this table shows the prevalence of the usability issues against the crypto APIs. Now I know you can see there's only the 3 crypto libraries here: OpenSSL, Bounce, Castle, and PyCrypto. That's quite simply because they had the most number of questions associated with them. I can go into more detail if need be. Okay, so in conclusion, Green and Smith principles are basically correct. We shouldn't ignore build issues. And yeah, the next time you use a crypto library, have a sniff. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for that. This is something that's we're consumers of research like this. This is important stuff. I'm a little bit, if I understood correctly, under usage you had both appropriateness and how to use. And for me, or at least my suspicion, is that this is where you actually have huge problems. And I'd love to see these teased out. So for example, if somebody asks, how do I use ROT13 to encode Unicode, to encrypt Unicode? The correct answer is don't. And I mean, I could come up with more plausible things, but I wanted to give an example for non-cryptographers. And so, because that, I believe, is actually where I suspect that developers make mistakes in appropriateness. And so I'd love to see that teased out, and wondering if you have any plans to look at that.
Yeah, well, in the paper we do talk about the future work and how we should probably focus on how the usability issues come to be and exactly what the issues, how the developer gets to that stage in the first place. So I'm sure we'll be covering that at some point. Thanks for the question.
Hello, thanks. I'm Alabe Nishe. Thanks again for this presentation. Actually got a chance to read your paper on the flight in. I was wondering, and maybe I missed this, I was wondering if you had a chance to look at GitHub issues and see if there was any correlation between the types of questions and some of the issues that developers ran into, and see if there was any correlation between the Stack Overflow questions that you analyzed.
No, I mean, like initially, yeah, we were looking at where we're going to scrape all these questions from. I did suggest GitHub at one point, but there's like tens of thousands of questions to look through. We looked at Stack Overflow because the questions are framed in such a way that the developer is asking the type of question where you can find like the issues the developers are actually facing. With GitHub, it's the questions, they're of a different type. They're structured in such a way that you won't really be finding the issues developers have using the library. They may point out like generally like system issues or something like that. But I guess that's something we can have a look at.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Yeah. Hi, Chris Long, Next Century. So you alluded to this in your talk, so maybe there's the answer in the paper. But one of the issues is different libraries are different sizes and different levels of detail and different degree of complexity. So you would expect that libraries that are more detailed and more powerful might at least require you to read more documentation to understand how to use. And so is there, I don't know, how do you address that, or do you see that as an issue, like trying to analyze the data and maybe modulate for that somehow?
What, so are you trying to say that, say if a new developer, like a novice, came and started using these libraries, how would they go about using it? Is that the question?
Sort of. Well, if there are lots of questions about a library, it could be, I guess maybe it's related to documentation, because it could be that the documentation is bad, or it could be that they just didn't read the documentation. So is it, I mean, I don't,
Right.
you know, you've got to avoid blaming the user, except that sometimes they do deserve it. So
No, you're right. Yeah, you're right. Okay, so passing the buck, it's one of the issues that I didn't cover during this this presentation. So basically, what this means is the user has asked a question, right? Now, if you do a simple search of what the question is in the library's documentation, it comes up as like the first result, right? It's super easy to find if you can do it, right? So what results from this is basically the user has delegated the question into the Stack Overflow community instead of going and reading the library documentation. So that stems down to passing the buck, basically. Yeah, but in terms of documentation, the quality of documentation ranges from library to library. I guess it's more for OpenSSL. They do cover a lot of the functions, but if you look at SJCL, for example, if you literally go into the library documentation, they have the function. Then the only other resource they have is the source code. So in terms of documentation, there's no example codes, there's no like actual sentences. So I'm guessing you'd need to be you need to have a high level of expertise to use something like that.
okay, thanks a lot.
Let's make this the final question. Sorry.
Thanks very much for the study. Really enjoyed the presentation. This is an issue that we deal with in industry a lot, actually. Main question was, did you find any correlation between, say, results of static analysis tools run on these libraries and the detected usability smells?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So static analysis is a section I will be looking at in my PhD at some point. For now, I just try to answer the very simple question of what developers are struggling with when they're using crypto APIs. Thanks. Okay. Thanks for your time, everyone. Yeah.